Thanks very much, Ed. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you so much for inviting me. I'm sorry I couldn't get there in person. So yes, I always think it's important to have a manageable subject when you only have a relatively short time to speak. So obviously I've chosen what it means to be human and the future of the planet. So I'm interested in the way that we think of ourselves as natural beings and as having a human nature, but at the same time we always remove ourselves from nature when we do that, as though we're only observing ourselves from the outside without ever being part of nature. And I think that's a very interesting. I don't have any answers here, and I'm not even sure I have a very coherent argument as such. But so there's hopefully a through line here that gets at what I'm trying to talk about. But I sort of said, oh, there's so many things that one could talk about in this with this topic. And I was to have a friend who's a social anthropologist, and she just said, oh, don't worry, just call it an assemblage and it'll be fine. So that's what this is. Then it's an assemblage. So this looking forward to a beastly future notion. So the image at the beginning there was from Forbes magazine, where they kind of constructed an image of what people would look like in the future, 10,000 years hence, and we'd all look like this with great big eyes, and and look like, in fact, as though we had been face tuned to look like Kylie Jenner with a makeover. And the notion that this could happen to us, and this would happen through natural selection. And the ideas here, I think they're very interesting, because it's like, well, you can achieve that now with these kind of image enhancing things. And it also sort of harks back, because they just look like these Margaret Keane big eyes paintings to me. So there doesn't seem to be anything very futuristic about these things. And I think sometimes that's what we're seeing when we don't really, we sort of lack the imagination to think of ourselves in the right kinds of ways. And I think we have this myth that we can transcend human being because we don't see ourselves as part of nature, but we don't think it through properly. And I think it's because we often don't understand the kind of animal that we are. So a major part, as Ed said, a major part of my research is trying to work out what human nature is, if it is anything at all. And so to do that, I investigate the behavior of humans and other animals, mainly primates, looking both for similarities, which you can see here are quite obvious, like these two little baboons playing together, and also the differences between us and other species, which are equally obvious, I think, in particular our use of tools and artifacts, both in the ways that they are, created and intended, and as we see here, in new and innovative ways. So that's a striking means by which we increase and enhance our biological and cognitive capacities. And I think it's also the feature that leads us to think that we stand apart from the natural world. And if you're a so-called transhumanist, that we will one day be able to leave biology behind altogether. And, that, I suggest, is because I think our views of human nature still retain a flavour of Descartes' philosophy. So we don't hold that there's some special mind stuff that is distinct from our body stuff. There's no ghost in the machine. But the ghostly mind, the non-ghostly mind, is still in the machine alone. And now it's part of the machine itself. So we see ourselves as fully machine-like. So our brains are computers that run on the machinery of our bodies. And that's obviously gives rise to these ideas of transhumanism, where you can see that the idea that we can evolve or create ourselves beyond our current physical and mental limitations can really take hold. So if your body just is a computer, then it's easy to see how your mind could be uploaded to the cloud or to a new robotic body. And if your body just is a mechanical device, then you can easily see how it can be upgraded to become ever more productive. And I think productive is the key word there, that we somehow, it all fits in with these notions of, humans as machines, fitting in with ideas of industrial capitalism and those kinds of things. And that's what machines are for, to be ever more productive. But I think what happens is we just lose control of our metaphors, and we fail to recognize that we are not machines. We're just, so this book, I've just finished reading this book by Elise Bohan, and as you can see here, you've got some coverage in The Guardian and places, and her argument is like, we need to move beyond our ape-brained meat sacks, and transhumanism can then save our species. So in this book, what she does is, argue for the notion of transhumanism on a variety of grounds, one of which is, well, we are a bit like this is where it speaks to Ed's talk in a similar way. We're just too irrational and dumb, and we have these ape brains, and we're just never going to solve the problems of the Anthropocene because we're just not intelligent enough. So we need to become more than human. We need to integrate with super intelligent AI, and then once we can get rid of all our human biases, we will then be an irrationality and our unwillingness to engage in proper rational argument, we'll be able to then solve those problems. And in the meantime, we will be able to solve the problem of death. That's another big thing. We'll solve the problem of death, and we will be able to biohack our bodies in various ways. And it won't matter that, nobody's having children anymore because we'll have solved death. So all the old people can carry on being very productive because they won't really be old. And it won't matter that the population has the working population reduced, because we'll still maintain it because all the old people are doing that. And then the young people, and she talks about things like, genetic engineering. She talks about we need a soma to keep us all amused, so we'll just spend all our time online and with our online avatars living lives for us. And the world will be full of sex robots, and we'll be able to. The other point is, while we're still having children, if people want children, they'll be raised in external wombs, because that way we save the pain. And her whole argument is based on the fact that life is painful. Being a ape-brained meat sack is painful. Illness is horrible. Old age is horrible. Birth is painful and horrible. It's a risk to mortality. If we could get rid of all these things, we should. And so we'll have, external wombs, and then the mothers and the fathers be able to see the babies being, developing, and all these things. And and then we will be able to be more than just human. And then in that way we'll solve all our problems. And I don't know, I sort of spoke to a number of people a bit older than me, approaching retirement, and I said this thing like, what do you think if you could just, if they solve death, then you could just carry on being productive forever and ever? And the faces were just a picture. It was like, good God, that's horrific. So I think in a way she's about 30 at least, but I think this is a book that only a young person can write. But she presents, it's a thought. She does it in an interesting and thought-provoking way, and I remain open to the fact that I could be wrong. But it seems to me partly what happens here, and this is something that you see, and in terms of when I think about how humans and non-human animals compare. That often what we do is that we often think of ourselves as more than human anyway, and so when you're comparing humans and animals, what we're trying to do is raise animals up to this intellectualized idealization of what we think we are, rather than what we actually are, which is a particular kind of animal. So as Pär Segerdahl says in this article that comparing the cognitive capacities of bonobos to humans and the ways in which we have done that, and this is a really nice quote, I think, that the opposite of the human is not animal, but the over-intellectualized lofty idealizations of what it means to be human, something which ironically is entirely inhuman. So we have the non-human always exists inside us as this idealizing tendency, and it's this idealized version of ourselves that we often project back onto other animals, and that's often what I spend a lot of my time thinking about. But I also think that this highly intellectualized lofty idealization of what it means, this inhuman thing, is what a lot of transhumanists have, because the people who push for transhumanism, that's what they sort of feel like they have a little bit more of anyway, that they are this kind of more intellectual, more far-seeing, the person who can see the world in a way that others can't, and that what we should really continue to aspire for, this inhuman ideal. And that will make us more than human. It will make us better, and I'm not sure that that's true. And these ideas come up a lot in the papers at the moment. This is an article by Mary Harrington, who's a British conservative writer, and I just love this phrase that she's come up with, which is luxury Gnosticism. And what she talks about here is in this article is that there's a sort of, the other thing you see in lots of arguments to do with transhumanism and these kinds of things is that disembodiment is a form of liberation, that there's a sort of dissociation from our bodies in the modern world, and we don't sort of feel that we are one with our bodies, and that there is this real separation between mind and body, this Cartesian thing that she associates with Gnosticism in the Christian tradition, that the body is inherently sinful and the mind is the only pure thing about us. So here she's talking about how we've grown very used to our digital social lives that we can edit and control and curate, well, that terrible word, to suit ourselves, to suit how we feel on the inside and how we wish ourselves to be presented. And so there are these two new reality shows which sound utterly unreal. And the common factor that so one of them is Alter Ego, where it's a singing competition where you inhabit a fully functional avatar, right? So you go one beyond The Voice and all these other kinds of programs. So nobody sees you at all. Your avatar is the one that sings and is judged. And then there's this program, Sexy Beast, where you go out on a date completely disguised, and you don't appear as yourself at all. And the common factor in these shows is that you're working a human self loose from its embodied presence in a physical body. And that gives ever more true freedom. That gives greater freedom to be your true self, which is a disembodied, spiritual thing. It's a disembodied soul. It's not actually something that has a body at all. So, and she sort of ties this to being very online, where many people we consolidate ourselves and repeat this lie that our cells are just these plastic, infinitely renewable, atomized, they're under our exclusive control as individuals. But there's and here she touches on things that you can find in people like George Herbert Mead and Vygotsky and those kinds of thinkers, where she says, well, there really is no such identity that's created independently of the ways that others see you. So she's also, I think these ideas are permeating the popular press. And the other thing I think is interesting is, Elise Bohan presents this positive case for transhumanism, where everything seems very simple and easy, because you have this idea of humans as machines that are, that we are just plug and play, and that there's this separation between mind and body. But there are earlier, this is interesting because the Great Mambo Chicken and Transhuman Condition is a book from the 90s, I think, which is a very funny book, where he goes and talks to all these transhumanists and their ideas of how the world could be different. And, a lot of and none of them have really come to pass in the time that the book has been written, even though they were all going to happen in the next 10 years. And this other book, by Mark McConnell, To Be a Machine, is where he goes and chats to all these people who, cryogenically freeze people's heads and bodies, and try to defeat death and all these kinds of things, and ultimately he comes to the idea that he'd rather be a living being. But again, these books tend to complicate the story that is presented in a very straightforward and simple way in these more positive transhumanist texts like the ones that Bohan has produced. And it's like, the other thing is, she has this thing where there's a long history of transhumanism, there's a long history of people trying to escape the notion that we are constrained by our biological bodies. But at the same time, there is this other strand that is brought out in this new book by Barbara Newman, which I just finished reading, which is really lovely. And she takes on Charles Taylor's idea that there's we have this buffered self of our secular age, this autonomous, hermetically sealed individual, and contrasts it to the porous self of other ages. And so she extends the argument and sort of fleshes it out with these medieval relationships. So she deals with teaching and romantic love and pregnancy and sort of demon possession, or mental illness, or what to call it now. And as one of the reviews of the book says, all of those things look really different when people take for granted that thoughts can enter other bodies directly. And it sort of, she deals with this strangeness of the past and makes the present seem very strange as well. So, she pushes us to ask how our modern assumptions shape our experience in ways that are so fundamental that we don't actually notice them. So, and then she brings it to the present day and talks about things like, puzzling phenomena like the way in which heart transplant recipients often develop relationships with their deceased donors and start to take on some of their traits and all these kinds of things, and psychoanalytic transference and the continuities between, ideas of demonic possession and how we understand modern day things like obsessive compulsive disorder. So, she talks about this idea of co-inherence, and this idea of selves as permeable and seeing ourselves in others and being made through others. So there are there is always this sense of, other ideas out there that see us as porous, that see us as animal-like, that don't see us as machines. And those ideas come to fruition, I think, most strongly in these ideas of people like Daniel Nickerson, John Dupre, who have argued for a process ontology. And in the book Everything Flows, Daniel Nickerson has a chapter, and he talks about how a better metaphor is that organisms are more like something like a candle flame than a machine. So a flame has an enduring and stable form, but that comes about as a result of continually ongoing set of dynamic processes. So what we see a flame, and we see it, and it seems like it's a thing, but it's really a process. And so that's a crucial difference, because machines can only take part in processes, but organisms are themselves processes. And you can turn a machine off and, it'll still sit there, but you can't do that to an organism. Well, you can, but that's what we call like being dead, right? So it's not really a functional organism at that point. So the body isn't a machine. Excuse me. It doesn't behave like one. Its parts are not plug and play, and they're not discrete. Your organisms are functional systems. And, many researchers and writers have started to highlight how our insistence on this mode of thinking of ourselves as machine-like is hurting progress in certain areas. So Randolph Nesse, who's sort of big into evolutionary medicine, and he's a psychiatrist, he has written a paper called "Your Body Is Not a Machine," and he says that, in psychiatry, I'm quoting from him now, in psychiatry, thinking about the mind as a machine has led to a debacle about diagnosis, because it doesn't take into account the relational nature of human beings and how we are not autonomous individuals in the way that we tend to think, and we are not at all machine-like. So the view of organisms as processes is, it's linked to an alternative to this Cartesian framework that I have been very interested in, and I have written about, which is called 4E cognition. And put simply, that's the idea that cognitive processes are grounded in action, and they are not purely brain-based phenomena. They also exploit the body and the environment. And in that way, you can solve problems more cheaply and than via energetically expensive brain tissue. So I'm interested in like the evolution of brain size. So these ideas were very interesting to me when I first came across them for that reason. So, in this alternative view, you've got organisms have very fuzzy boundaries where physiological and cognitive processes are spread across the brain, the body, and the environment, so that when you exploit environmental structures and resources and you use technology to enhance capacity, what we're seeing is not a source of difference in the animal kingdom in the way that it's often portrayed, but I think it's one of actual deep continuity between humans and the rest of the animal kingdom. So we can see this in, these being made in the right way saves on brain tissue. So this bug here has a gearing mechanism in its legs that synchronizes their movement, and it enables them to make these exquisitely timed, highly propulsive jumps. And it does so more precisely than neural control of the legs could actually achieve. So it's a better system than using the brain. So you can see the gears. You can see the gears here in the legs. If you've ever wondered why a seahorse looks so very boxy and square, That's because a square tail enables firmer anchoring to marine plants than a circular tail does, and that reduces the need for very fine motor control. So that again saves on neural tissue. So you can see, and you can see it here. This is a round tail. This is these mechanical experiments they did showing the difference in the abilities of different kinds of tails. So you can see how a square tail it provides a closer, tighter grip to the pole there, and you're getting that for free. You're getting that extra grip for free without having to have it use any neural tissue or to use any fine muscular control to do that. It's just inherent in the way that the body is put together. Animals also exploit the environment to solve their problems, and I think my favourite example of this at the moment is this mud skipper, which is a fish that feeds on land, and it can't simply suck in floating food as it does in the water. It can't just suck in particulate matter from the water. So what it does is it brings a mouthful of water with it onto land, and then it squirts it out at high speed, and then like sucks it back in again at high pressure. And so what it's doing is effectively producing a tongue, a watery tongue. And so it shoots out and it kind of grabs food in a way that, like, say, a gecko or something, how that grabs insects. So, again, you have, instead of evolving complex machinery in the animal, and I'm saying the word machinery, which is very bad, instead of involving complex processes within the organism, it exploits what's already there in the environment. And of course, the notion that we are the only species that uses technology, I think, is also quite misplaced. So termites construct complex mounds that control both temperature via a form of air conditioning and that prevent the buildup of carbon dioxide. So physiological processes also extend beyond the body of the termite and the termite colony. So the termite mounds can be viewed as external lungs. So in this view, as I've said, organisms have these fuzzy boundaries where physiological and processes that would other than require neural control are spread across brain, body, and environment, and we are no different. So we're doing it. We may do more of it. We may do it on a broader scale. It may shape our lives more extensively than other organisms, but I think this is a source of continuity rather than difference. And if you take a process-based view, this becomes very, very obvious. The other thing that I think that we get wrong is this notion of transcendence that comes about, that you see this a lot, that the idea that we have transcended the biological imperative because we don't behave in ways that would be predicted by the theory of natural selection. I think this also can be linked to what happened after the Second World War, where obviously, after the Holocaust and the horrors that were perpetuated by the Nazis, UNESCO got together a bunch of anthropologists and they put forward a declaration that said, humans are cultural, they're purely cultural, they're environmentally created, there are no biological aspects to humans that are unchangeable, that dictate and determine our lives. So it became these creatures purely of culture, and that we could reject the biological imperative that drives other species. And so that notion that we can defy our biology is also sort of built into us in an evolutionary sense. And so you even get people like David Attenborough, whom, as a British person, I obviously love and revere dearly. But he says here, humans have stopped evolving. Now, and so it says here, we have put a halt to natural selection of our own free will, and he predicts the cultural evolution of the future. And as much as I love Sir David, this is just simply wrong. He says here, we stopped natural selection as soon as we started being able to rear 95 to 99% of babies that are born. We are the only species to have put a halt to natural selection of its own free will, as it were. Now, there's no denying that fewer people die an early death today in the industrialized world. We have made staggering medical advances that have reduced infant mortality and increased our lifespan. Public health initiatives have also reduced the impact of disease. It's no doubt true that selection against unhealthy babies was stronger in Shakespeare's time, 400 years ago, 500 years ago. But it's also the case that many of those who died in childhood did so you know, not because of the genes they carried. They weren't selected against because of their genetic complement. They died because they lived in an environment that didn't have, you know, antiseptic, antibiotics, no understanding of the causes of infectious disease. So there were accidents and untreated wounds and just simple bad luck. So natural selection can be as strong today as it was back then, or perhaps it can be even stronger because mortality rates are only half of the story. So natural selection is also about differential reproduction and not survival. So what we really need to know is whether the people who no longer die because of these medical interventions that prevent genetically linked traits from being fatal go on to reproduce at the same level as people who lack those traits. Because if they don't, if they reproduce less or not at all, then natural selection still continues to act, despite the fact that those individuals are living longer and hopefully happier lives. So we have to take into account, you know, notions of differential reproduction. And this comes in again in terms of thinking about fertility, and that's something that I've been very interested in as well, like our ideas about fertility and how we think about having children, and when we want children, when we don't want children, because there's this idea that people only want sex and they never want children, which also doesn't seem to be all that true, but I'll leave that to one side for now. But there's been this decline in fertility rates across the world, you know, that since the beginning with the Industrial Revolution, you've seen this thing called the demographic transition, where you go from a high mortality, high fertility regime to a low mortality, low fertility regime. So you can see this covers the European Union, Japan, the USA, and the entire world. It covers the period from 1960 to 2020, and you've got total fertility rate per woman on the y-axis. And you can see there's been this massive decline, with some areas of the world now below replacement level fertility. So they're below the 2.4 rate that you would need to replace yourself, with a bit left over to account for accidents and the like. So there's this also fuels this idea that we are defying our biology, because, you know, we have more resources than we've ever had before in the history of our planet and the history of our species, and yet we don't translate that into children. And that's what life history theory would predict, that when you have more resources, that you put more of those resources into improving and increasing your reproductive success, and we don't seem to do that. We could sustain more children than we apparently do. Or do we? So this is the thing that we know, maybe we're not transcending things after all. So people like Oscar Berger, George Burnside, John DeLong, who have worked on these ideas, they argue that the dramatic increases in non-metabolic energy that we have seen used in the last 10,000 years or so have been made possible by agricultural revolution and industrial and other technological revolutions. We should factor those into our assessments of human life history theory. So this is this kind of extended idea of how we have augmented and enhanced our biological capacities. And so they say we need to factor in the amount of energy we use as though it's our somatic energy. And the reason why they argue that is because fecundity and reproductive rates of human females are not just constrained by their own metabolism, as in other mammals, but they vary with total energy use. So as you can see here, the amount of extra somatic energy used by a population is a good predictor of fitness components like fertility, child mortality, and age at first reproduction. So what you've got here is log per capita energy use in watts on the x-axis in each of these panels, and then you've got log. These are log scale, so the births per year. So you've got all mammals, non-human primates. The little diamond is our hunter-gatherer populations, and industrial populations are the open circle. So you can see that as we use greater somatic energy, we have fewer births per year. Greater use of energy is associated with lower mortality of children under the age of 5. Life expectancy increases, and age at first reproduction also increases. So as you use more energy, you have fewer offspring, you live longer, and you take longer to produce those first offspring, but many more of those offspring survive. So factoring these things in, when you do this, you can produce this kind of graph where you look at the mass of the organisms under consideration, and you look at their log per capita energy used in watts. So you've got basal metabolic rate and functional metabolic rate there, and you can plot industrial populations here of humans. So what you can do is use this regression line of metabolic energy, and from that work out how large a primate would we be if all the extra somatic energy that we used was actually somatic energy. How large an animal would we be if we did that? So what you can, when you do that, what is a 60 kilogram human uses 120 watts of metabolic energy. And in a modern industrial society, a 60 kilogram human uses 11,000 watts of energy. So when you convert that into what size primate we would be if all of that extra somatic energy was somatic energy, we would be a 32,000 kilogram primate. And if we were a primate that big, life history theory predicts we would only produce roughly about 1.5 offspring during our lifetime, because they would require so much investment and time to grow and all those kinds of things over their lifespan. So if you factor in the way in which we have extended our bodies through the use of extrasomatic energy, we are still in line with what evolutionary life history would predict. And so maybe we aren't transcending anything at all when we consider these things in a broader context, and we bring in these processes and treat them as though they are the biological processes that they ultimately are. So I think this idea of transcendence is a myth. I don't think, because it goes with this notion of that we are machine-like, and so we have minds that are separate from bodies, so our minds can transcend our bodies, and also that because we are those particular kinds of organisms where our minds transcend our bodies and exert more control over them, we can also ignore these biological imperatives that come about through evolutionary processes. And I think there's doubt there as to whether that's actually true if you do the right kind of analysis and treat energy in the way that is an extension of our bodies, and not something where when it's convenient for us, we just leave it out of the calculation altogether. Selection, obviously, as I've said, is ongoing. It's like selection is relentless. So natural selection is still continuing, but we also intervene in our own selection through assisted reproductive technologies. So these are I mean, I think these are very interesting. So there's a very good paper by Hannover et al. Called "Can IVF Influence Human Evolution?", where they discuss the various ways in which when you have this is the point at which selection is most intense, at the point of fertilization, and what the kinds of gametes that are selected under laboratory conditions are very different from the kinds of gametes that work best under the conditions of the female reproductive tract. So the selective environments are very, very different. So what you see is the kinds of sperm that are favored in the female reproductive tract are like these very steady marathon-like swimmers. And in the lab, when they filter out sperm to get the ones that to use in IVF, they go for the very fast ones that can get up the tube very quickly. So that's a selection pressure. And when you're looking at eggs, you're looking for eggs that can survive the being punctured by a needle in a particular way to inject sperm into them. So you're creating a whole new set of selection pressures. And the other thing that the paper argues is that IVF may well be facilitating the propagation of genetically heritable traits of subfertile couples, so that those offspring of those couples could also themselves show a risk of subfertility. So what you might end up with is a proportion of the population that becomes utterly dependent on artificial and assisted reproductive technologies to enable reproduction at all, because they've been selected for under these conditions of the IVF laboratory. And I think the other thing to remember is that this is, on the 25th of July 1978, Louise Brown was born. She was the first IVF baby. That technique was pioneered by Patrick Steptoe, who was a gynecologist, Robert Edwards, who was a physiologist, and also this nurse here, Jean Purdy, who doesn't get the recognition she deserves, even though she was a lab technician, and she played a really significant and increasingly vital role and to the extent that when her mum was ill and she had to go and look after her, they had to stop work in the laboratory because she was so vital. So, and it was Jean Purdy who saw that a fertilized egg had begun to divide and make new cells. So she was the first person to ever see Louise Brown when she was still an embryo. So since then, it's more than 5 million IVF babies have been born, and I think there's two things here. One, this is where I have to have my own hedge about my resistance to these ideas of transhumanism, because this is quite this is one of those same things. When the news came out that there was going to be a test tube baby, as they were called, it was viewed really with great suspicion. And people were talking about this like Frankenstein babies and people playing God, and it's just terrible. And this is just an appalling thing to do. We cannot behave in these ways, and this is going to be some, the baby will be an anomaly and a freak and all this kind of stuff. And I remember this at the time. I was 10, 11 at the time when this happened, and then what happened was that Louise Brown was born, and everyone just went, wow, she's lovely, what a great thing we've done. We've just got this beautiful human baby who looks completely normal, and her parents were so overjoyed. And I say, and I'm telling this story in the way as an adult would tell it, but when it happened, I was 10 and 11, coming up to 11, and I was the only person called Louise in my entire class, and I was the only Louise I ever knew, whereas everyone else at the time was called Emma, and there were like 15 Emmas in my class. And the only thing I really remember about Louise Brown being born is the fact that she was called Louise. So it's like just a massive, so it was really just the major ego trip for me at the time. But I think that this is something that does give me pause, because we can change our minds very quickly about the nature of kind of things that seem to go against the notion of ourselves as animal processes. But the other thing I think is important to recognize is 1978 isn't that long ago, and Louise Brown is still only 40. Well, she's 45 now, but she's 44, so she's not even coming up to, she's only just reaching the end of her reproductive lifespan. And there's follow-up data that suggests there potentially is an increase in high blood pressure, elevated fasting glucose. There's an increase in total body fat composition, advanced bone age, some instances of thyroid disorder in IVF offspring. And whether they're due to IVF per se, or whether they are associated with the genetic origins of the children, or they're associated with the particular nature of IVF treatment, which is something you could change, we still don't know. But it's not the case. We don't really know what the long-term consequences of IVF are, because we haven't been doing it for long enough. So I think that's, again, is a thing of caution that we have to think about. And I think this is where these ideas that Elise Bohan has come up with, where she sort of says, well, we will just have artificial wombs, and we won't have to worry about the pain and the difficulties and the mortality risks of pregnancy. And she refers to this where these premature lambs were sort of grown in a bag for a particular period. And I have to say, shockingly, when I showed my husband this, he just said yum, and got it completely wrong about what they were trying to do here. So what the argument here is this is just to improve incubators and to improve the long-term prospects of preterm infants, babies born too early, and it can improve the ways in which we treat newborn infants, premature infants in the neonatal ICU. But again, I think this is treating things as humans, it's like too much like plug and play, because it's sort of, and if you talk, and I, you know, we've if you read some of the things that surround this, some of the popular press around this, it makes it, they make it sound like it's the womb itself that's all important, and that's like an easy bake oven. And so you can just, you know, it's easy enough to put them outside the body as it is inside the body, forgetting that the womb is not the only thing that creates the baby. And the woman's whole system changes to accommodate gestation and birth. And so I think one of the things that has become very apparent in recent years is this notion of the microbial rush. So during pregnancy, there's two things that happen. Like one is to do with microbes, is the mother's intestinal tract stores up energy, and that's through a change in the microbial structure of the gut that allows more energy to be transferred into the blood and into the fetus, into the placental fetus. And at the same time, there's another population of microbes in the vagina that also start shifting. So women of reproductive age carry many more lactobacilli in their vagina canals, which makes the vaginal canal more acidic and provides a defense against dangerous bacteria. And during pregnancy, these lactobacilli flourish, they crowd out other resident species and invaders. And so they're gearing up for the main event, which is birth. So when the mother's waters break, there's this rush of fluid that's released. It sweeps up bacteria and as it flows down her thighs. So there's this splash of microbes that is dominated by lactobacilli that colonizes the mother's skin. The baby, as it emerges, ingests the microbes from the vaginal canal. So the first fluid the baby sucks in are mother's microbes, including some fecal matter. The labour is really not at all an antiseptic process at all. And what's clear is that these microbes that immediately populate the baby's gut are very important in a variety of ways, in terms of setting up the gut for receiving food and for preventing infection and setting up the immune system. And cesarean births, the founding microbes that you see there are completely different in composition. So the founding microbes in cesarean births bear no relationship to the mother's vagina. They are from mouth, gut, and skin. So they're all the kinds of things that float on human skin, that float in the air of the surgery room, and they're not colonized by their mother's lactobacilli. So the founding populations of microbes that you see when you compare vagina versus cesarean birth are not those selected by, you know, hundreds of thousands of years of human evolution or even longer. So this is again a process that we've only really started to fully understand quite recently, and it's not something that is easily kind of rectified or built into these notions of artificial wombs, but they're vital for development. So there's an increasing body of evidence that suggests that only vaginal delivery promotes the production of certain cytokines that are these small proteins that are crucial for controlling the growth and activity of other kinds of immune cells. Only vaginal delivery promotes the production of particular kinds of cytokines that are implicated in neonatal immunity, and nobody knows why that is as yet. So you can mimic the vaginal microbiome and apply that to baby skin and those kinds of things, but it's not triggering the immune system in the same way that vaginal birth does, for reasons that are not as yet clear. There's also the notion that the endometrium of the lining of the womb was completely free of microbes has also come under a bit of pressure in recent years. This was from 2016. So the endometrial microbiome is largely the same as that shared with the vagina. It has these lactobacillus dominant communities, and if you have and then, you know, it can vary, and sometimes if you compare like the lactobacillus, they did modeling and machine learning and prediction models in this that's reported on here, and if you have a non-lactobacillus non-lactobacillus dominant endometrial fluid, that's associated with the diminished implantation rates and an increased risk of miscarriage in women who undergo in vitro fertilization. So the endometrium is also a massively important part of this process, which is not something that's been taken into account in IVF up to now. And it's not something that comes about, you know, that these artificial wombs, these babies in the bag that are being developed, you know, these processes are not, it seems unlikely that maybe it will help preterm infants, but it doesn't seem to be something that's going to recreate the womb itself. And then just as a, you know, one last example is breast milk, when it comes in a few days later, contains carbohydrates called oligosaccharides that babies themselves can't digest, but the microorganisms in their gut, like Bifidobacterium infantis, can eat those oligosaccharides. So the breast milk is constituted to give favored bacteria a head start against competing bacteria. So we've now got this process where breast milk is full of things that aren't feeding the baby, but they're feeding the baby's microbes. So again, we're not even like, you know, independent organisms on that scale. So this is a process that extends beyond the mother and the infant to help the infant's microbiota grow. And that again is a process that's only just recently becoming better understood. So the bioactive molecules in breast milk regulate microbiota development, and these human milk oligosaccharides, HMOs, are the most abundant bioactive molecules in human milk, and they have multiple beneficial functions. So they support as I said, they support the growth of beneficial bacteria. They have anti-pathogenic effects. They have immune modulating effects. They stimulate intestine barrier function. So they're doing all of these things as part of the process of gestation and birth and the early postnatal period. And that's not something that technology is well set up to do. And it seems to me, I'm just very reminded of Rodney Brooks's work, where he, you know, built these robots. He was the pioneer of behavior-based robotics, and he had this thing like, you know, the world is its own best model. So unlike computer simulations, when you have a robot that you chuck into the world and get it to solve its own, try and get it to solve a particular problem, you get things like friction and gravity and all those kinds of things for free. They come along for free. And it seems to me that in a sense, you know, that's what we're dealing with here. It's like this push to create a technology that will relieve mothers of the burden of and women of the burden of pregnancy. But it's doing it in a way that makes it's like, seems to me like it's overcomplicating things, because we're not dealing with the idea of it as a process very well, because you get all the things here like the microbial rush and the cytokines and the oligosaccharides and all those things. They all come for free, so to speak. They're not free, obviously, but you know what I mean. They're coming for free because the process has been built up over eons of evolutionary time, and there are all these things that we don't even, you know, probably even more things that we don't even know about that are really important. So why not work to improve maternal conditions and women's birth experience? You know, because what we're talking about is one process, not two machines, not a mother and a baby. And there's this organization called, you know, Improving Birth, where Chris and the woman who is involved, one of the women involved in it is a woman called Kristen Pascucci, and she says, you know, there's this idea that because we are these, you know, faulty machines, that babies need to be rescued by birth. And it's, you know, the way doctors talk about it is as if women and their babies are fundamentally in opposition to each other, and that the body is kind of, you know, dangerous by design. And it sort of reinforces these notions that the doctor's job is to kind of extract the fetus from its incubator, that the womb is just treated as though it's an incubator whereas in fact what you're talking about is a process by which, you know, one organismal process gives rise and produces another organismal process in a particular way. So this is why transhumanism worries me, because it sees us as these autonomous machines there to be improved on, and we do so by using resources that come at a cost to the sustainability and health of other species and to the planet as a whole. And in fact, if we are organisms that are leaky, dynamic processes, and so we should recognize that these kind of transhuman ideas are probably quite a foolish goal, because we need a more symbiotic view of our lives. So I think this idea of forest bathing is very interesting, where you spend out time outside in wooded areas, it's good for you. And the idea is, this is because, it's psychologically uplifting, it makes you feel better, but like it just operating on the mind as distinct from the body. But in fact, what research is increasingly showing is you're exposed to particular kinds of microorganisms that contribute to our microbiota, and they give your immune system a boost. They can help lower blood pressure. So the process that occurs is a physiological one, not just like some kind of psychological boost that doesn't affect, that is kind of distinct from our bodies, which is how it was often discussed. And so it shows when we think we're individuals, but obviously we form part of an interdependent web. So I think the better way of going about this is to see that we are and always have been transhuman. We are leaky, living animal processes that spread across brain, body, and world. And so we might be able to deal with the Anthropocene more and improve human life and all planetary life by recognizing this, and recognizing that what we also need, I think, is a sort of leaky process of knowledge production, that we should aim not to sort of transcend nature and seek only these technological solutions, but to sort of transcend our disciplinary boundaries in ways that help us understand what it means to be human, which is to say what it means to be a leaky animal organismic process, and how that we are never individual, hermetically sealed, autonomous machines. And in that way, I think we can come to a better understanding of what it means to live a good life in the future. So that's all I've got to say. So thank you very much indeed. And thank you for your attention.
Okay, thank you, Louise. Can you hear me still?
Yes, I can.
So I think we've got 5 minutes or so for a couple of questions, but we've only got one microphone. So if you want to ask a question, I will run. You can run up there.
Yeah, okay. I can run up. So there was one here, right?
Yeah. Thank you, Louise. It's a very nice and inspiring talk. So you does it work?
Yeah, it works.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you mentioned something about the IVF, which was a big debate and in your time. But right now the technology is much more advanced than previously. And even now we can edit genes and we can design. You know what I mean? So it's more advanced, much better technology than before. Sometimes it can be used for design babies. I mean, how do you comment on this use?
I don't know. I'm very, again, it's one of those things. I think we need to be very cautious about editing genes and how we go about doing that and what that means. And because I think we don't fully understand a lot of it. We think we have a good understanding, and I think we often, the notion of gene editing is treated as though, again, it's like, we edit this thing and we change the machinery of the body and this in this kind of way. And the notion that there could be knock-on effects and cascade effects to other processes doesn't seem to me to always be taken into account as well. It's good. And I think it's interesting, like, what's her name, the woman who came up with CRISPR-Cas, like Jennifer Dowden. She was one of the first people who sort of said we need to stop this and have a big short talk about the about the ethics of it and the likely consequences, and think this through before we get going. Because just because we can do this, should we do it? And I think that's probably a lot of what when I read about these massive advances, it's all done in terms of like, well, we can do this, and I don't think there's enough consideration of whether we should do it. and the likely, because I do think there are things that we can't foresee, and I mean, as well as much as the technology is increasing in IVF and things like that, it's not been around long enough for us to know the long-term consequences of it. And just having more surviving babies is not perhaps the measure. It's like the quality of life of people, and do people have good lives? And I'm sure the majority of them do, but I think it's important that we know what the long-term outcomes are.
All right, we have one more question.
Hi, Louise. This is Sune.
Hi.
So good to see you in your 8 square meters face here in this room. So good to see you.
Horrendous.
No, not at all. So I got one question, but perhaps in 2 versions. And so the first version you comes with, I mean, you're talking about the 4E cognition and how the mind and the fuzzy boundaries, all the things that we've been saying in the 4E community for years, which seems to be kind of at odds with your critique of the transhumanism, because it seems to me that the transhumanists actually more or less gives you a kind of embodied version of 4E. They take the 4E principles and apply them to the biological body. And that seems to be a bit of a dissonance between your view on 4E cognition and your views on transhumanism. And strangely, I agree with you on both views, but so I just want to ask about that.
Yeah. I mean, that's the thing, isn't it? And I mean, I think that's, in a sense, that's the key question, because it is true, right? That if you're a 4E cognition person, then you say, oh, we can and do extend our abilities beyond the limits of our, what constitutes our cognitive system, what constitutes our biological system doesn't just sit with our bodies, right? In that standard way, and that the use of fossil fuels and everything, like, speaks to that. But I think the thing that links that makes it not dissonant is the fact that I do think the transhumanists have this machine-like metaphor, and they have this Cartesian view of mind and body, and those are not things that come into the 4E cognition arena. That there is the one of the fundamental things is that there is no, the mind and the body are not 2 distinct things. And the other thing I think is that it takes much more seriously the notion of processes, and doesn't view organisms as machine-like in that same way. Now, that doesn't mean to say there can't be people who do that, but I would say, like, in my understanding of it, I think the fact that you're emphasizing processes that might extend beyond the boundary of the skin, and the fact that you are not treating mind and body as 2 distinct phenomena, and that you just reject entirely that Cartesian view, I think that's the way you reconcile those things and show that if you want to have a transhumanism, I think that we're already transhuman. The transhumanism has to come over more and be more 4E in order to really do it properly and understand what's being dealt with, because it's not going to work otherwise. I just think Elon Musk's wasting his money with his Neuralink and all that kind of stuff.
Thank you so much.